Well, this is certainly not the news I was expecting. About a month removed from the NBA season, head coach Ime Udoka of my Boston Celtics likely suspended for the year. This comes after a report that Woj put out that he had a consensual relationship with a staff member that broke Boston Celtics code of conduct for their employees. Kyle, initial reaction?
Well, we don't have all the information, so that makes it difficult to figure out exactly what behavior Udoka conducted that would lead to the suspension. This is a Boston Celtics team rule thing. I don't know exactly what the NBA rule is when people sign contracts, especially people who are in the basketball operations side. And I don't know exactly the details of those rules. So I don't know exactly the information when it comes to like any code of conduct laws and rules and such, both from the NBA and the Celtics. We know that he's getting suspended for the year, and we know that Ime Udoka is going to presumably still be the coach after the fact, which suggests that he broke an ethical line and not a line that was one that warranted the termination of his job. And I think it's an interesting position because there hasn't really been anything quite like this where we're talking about, I mean, you could point to situations like in baseball with cheating scandals, but nothing like this that warrants a long-term suspension. And so I think it'd be better to have more information around this case. And I don't want to do the speculation without knowing, because when you hear a story of sexual infidelity, all of a sudden men flock to that story and start going crazy about that idea. And I think that out of respect for whatever that situation is going to be, I don't want to do speculation. It's just we know that whatever conduct Ime Udoka engaged in is worthy of, I mean, it basically an unprecedented suspension because it's behavior that doesn't warrant a firing, but warrants being away from the team for a year. It's a very unique situation, at least as far as I can remember.
It's interesting just knowing, or at least what the report says, that this was a consensual relationship happened in the workplace. And, I've been in workplaces too, where they make you sign the contracts that you will not date such and such because, it may create a conflict of interest down the line. And I guess when you consider that Ime is the head coach, is a powerful person in that organization, you worry about that blurring the lines later. And I guess this is, if you're the Celtics, your way of protecting yourself just in case. Who knows? Years later, I don't know the staffer. I don't know what their interests are or what their future is in the NBA. But what if they say, hey, Ime was a person in a position of power and he took advantage of that, for this relationship. Mm-hmm. Consensual now, but who knows what that could turn into or morph into 10 years down the line. So maybe this is the Celtics' way of prematurely handling this. It's unprecedented too, because usually you don't see an organization shooting itself in the foot in terms of the product they are able to put out on the field. For the Celtics, Ime Udoka, first-year head coach, takes you to the NBA Finals, and less than a year later, we're talking about this. That's insane to me. We talked a little bit about this last night. We talked about what could the suspension be, because we already knew that it was circulating in the rumor mill about a month, maybe some games, a year for a coach that was ascending. And too, if you're like the players, so let's talk about like a year later after he comes off the suspension, what are the players thinking? Are they just going to embrace him with open arms? Or let's say the Celtics have a down year, and that down year they feel is because of Ime. Don't you think that kind of like puts an impediment on leadership from Ime's standard?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
It just completely changes that locker room dynamic. We'll see if like the Celtics even have a good season. It's going to fall on the assistant coach. So Woj just put it out there that Joe Mazzulla is going to be taking over for head coaching duties for the year. So that puts an end to the rumor of Brad Stevens potentially coming down from the box and going down back to the hardwood. It looks like they're going to stick with the assistant coach. And that's probably the smart move, because you also don't want people thinking this flip-flop relationship between who's the real head coach. Is it Brad Stevens? Is it Ime when you talk about a year later? There's a danger in that too. What if the Celtics have a really good season? What if they do better than they did the previous year? Then you have this situation. You talk about like when quarterbacks sometimes get hurt and their backup comes in and does a better job. Remember what Nick Foles did that one year, wins the Super Bowl, and then that creates an awkward locker room dynamic with him and Carson Wentz. That could happen too. There's a whole can of worms that got open with the suspension. It just surprises me too. Again, this is a Celtics in-house suspension. This isn't an NBA suspension.
part of this is, and you mentioned it earlier, is the idea of him being in a leadership position. And therefore, there is a power imbalance between whoever it is that he's having a relationship with, because it's hard for anyone to be on the same level of leadership in a male dominated industry the way that Ime Udoka is as head coach of the Boston Celtics, former NBA player for a decade. Like, it's hard to, that's a person in a position of power. And we should expect that, and most of our organizations, that our leaders are held to a higher standard than, say, the people who are employees, which is important to bring up given the fact that now Robert Sarver is going to be pressured to sell his team, despite the fact that he only got a year suspension and a fine.
Well, let me ask you, do you think there's any situation in which you could date down? Any workplace. I'm not even talking NBA locker room. I'm just any workplace. I don't know, you're the supervisor at a fast food restaurant. Can you date your subordinate?
I am willing to talk it out in a conversation with nuance and involving more women. Like, hearing the perspective of women who are not in positions of power is important when talking about these conversations and how they feel about pressure from people who are in positions of power to have relationships. I think that's a conversation that's much more complex than this weird world of sports that Ime Udoka finds himself in, because we just don't have the information available. So I would say
it's a catch-22.
There's a lot
because
of nuance.
Women also want to date successful men. And I would also say, like, you talk about the head coach of a basketball team. That's a hell of a successful man right there. Sometimes you build yourself up to try and put yourself in a position where you're looked highly upon. And well, that kind of means you can't do certain things because of it.
And that's a situation where it's
you can't date a subordinate or coworker or whatever you consider.
That's the situation where it's morally reprehensible, and also, for whatever the reasons may be, because I also acknowledge this is pro sports. If Ime Udoka adds value, he will be retained the same way that the Boston Red Sox fired Alex Cora because of the cheating scandal with the Astros and then hired him back a year later. Like, if you add value, you will get second chances and you will get to keep the position that you have. If Ime Udoka was, for example, the general manager of the Minnesota Timberwolves named Gerson Rosas, who was also fired for having an inappropriate relationship with someone within the workplace, Gerson Rosas was not someone who was worth retaining because the Timberwolves didn't want him around in the first place. And he wasn't doing a great job running the team. So I understand that part of sports and how we'll let people come back as long as they have value. So I'm not going to say, like, we don't know exactly what ethical or reprehensible line. Again, we don't have all the information. More details could come out that do lead to Ime Udoka being fired. A lot of it is public pressure, and the Boston Celtics are obviously operating under their own code of conduct, which hopefully protects people in non-positions of power.
In fairness, though, again, this, as far as we know, consensual relationship, both parties were down. How my parents met within the workplace. Before the internet, most people met their significant other or spouse in the workplace. It's not a crazy idea. It's not a crazy suggestion that sometimes, and specifically in this one. Okay, so she's a team staffer. That's all I know, right? You're traveling together. You're on the road together. You're talking with each other. Maybe you find out, oh, she likes the same movies I do. She likes the same music I do. And one thing leads to another. And then suddenly it happens, that can happen. That can happen very organically. I understand the Celtics wanting to protect their best interest, because if, again, years down the road, something shifts in their relationship and it becomes toxic, then you don't want to have that situation in your locker room, in your workplace. But hell, to play devil's advocate here, sometimes these relationships could morph into more. If he may put a ring on it, then would we be talking about it in the same way?
In those cases, leaders are held to a higher standard than the rest of the employees. It's the fact that Ime Udoka is the head coach of the Boston Celtics is, I assume, the reason that he's being suspended, because the stereotype of athletes cheating on spouses is something that's been played out over decades to the point where it's now a lazy stereotype. Like, we know this exists in the NBA. Family Guy was making jokes about this like 13 years ago about infidelity in sports. Like, that stereotype's been played out so much to this point that,
but we don't know the relationship between Long either, too. Like, is this an open marriage? Is this like or are they even married? I don't even think they're married. I think they have a kid together, but they could be on the outs. Stuff like that happens too. That exists. Like, just talking about it on a human level, not just who Ime is or who the staffer is or the Boston Celtics. If this was happening at a Dairy Queen or something. I don't know. I'm mentioning Dairy Queen, but would we question it as much if like we knew that, hey, these people just get along, they're
Oh,
having a
well,
good.
if it were not a high profile job, we just wouldn't give a shit. Like, that's the thing I've learned about people in society, is that because this is a famous person being involved in this, and a famous leader at that, because again, this is a position of power that Ime Udoka has, and has the ability to abuse that power. And
Has the
therefore,
ability,
this
but
is
doesn't mean he necessarily abused said power.
Yes. And that's why he's not being fired. It's just because this is, I assume, an immoral situation or an unethical situation for
Celtics
him in a
protecting
position of
themselves.
power within the workplace.
It's the Celtics protecting themselves. That's how I look at this. They just don't want this to morph into something worse, which, given the political climate we live in today, I understand they don't want to be involved in that years down the line, 5 years down the line, 5 months down the line, 5 days down the line. Stuff can like shift in terms of how people view one situation to another. So I understand why they're trying to, in theory, get ahead of this situation. Just sucks for Ime, sucks for the team. It's going to suck for his leadership moving forward, how the Celtics view him moving forward, how guys who are developing in their careers, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Robert Williams, all these guys look at him moving forward. We'll see how that dynamic goes. It's a great opportunity, certainly, if you're Mazzulla, hey, take the reins and run with it. We'll see what has this situation morphs to. Like, you mentioned the possibility they still have an open door firing. I don't think it's going to get to that point.
Yeah, we just don't have all the information.
Yeah,
we don't have all the information
for the year.
right
That's
now.
still developing too. It could very well turn into a couple months. There could be appeals process. There's a lot of things that could go on in this that may shift what the overall suspension, punishment, or whatever it may be is. But overall, whatever your thoughts are, drop them below in the comments. Kind of want to get some feedback, how you're feeling about the situation. Were the Celtics in the right to make this move? Was Ime in the wrong? This, that, other, anything and all, how you're feeling? I kind of want to hear your thoughts. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on all our social medias at Juju Talk Sports, Kyle Ledbetter, at SlumpbusterPod on Twitter. Stay safe, happy, and healthy, and we'll see you on the next one.